On February 5th, 2025, I met with Salisbury resident and fellow organizer to Maria Payan, Rachel Casteel. Our first stop was a Save-A-Lot and Family Dollar parking lot across from a Perdue facility to talk air pollution. Could you describe for me where we are right now?
Yes, so we are at the Perdue processing plant in Salisbury, and we're here because there is frequently, thankfully not right now, but a pretty frequent stench that permeates through the whole community from this processing plant. And so right now we're looking at a lot of trucks that are waiting either to unload or get loaded up with, it almost looks like very old style milk crates stacked along the back. They're typically like 3 across, and let's see, that one maybe is like 2, 4, 5 deep. We see them pretty much every day throughout Delmarva and in the community, and they'll either be carrying birds that are going to slaughter for the processing plant, or they could be empty heading over to a farm or a CAFO facility to pick up the birds for slaughter.
Mm-hmm. And you live nearby here, you said, right?
Yeah, about a 2-minute drive.
Do you ever smell the smells coming from the plant where you live?
Yeah, pretty frequently. We notice seasonally some changes. In the summer, it is a lot more extreme. In the winter, we'll have more good days than bad. But this morning, it was definitely suffocating. We walk outside and it greets you first thing in the morning, drifts the whole way over to my house. And then in the summer, if it's particularly humid or it's a really warm day, it feels almost as if the air concentrates, and you walk outside and it's a lot more smothering than normal, and it takes a lot longer for it to disperse.
Have you had any, are there any symptoms that come with the smell?
Yeah, there are. My partner has asthma, so he has higher frequency of asthma attacks out here. For myself, it's been allergy-like symptoms that picked up when we moved here, just sort of throat feeling, like post-nasal drip kind of, and sneezing. And I have noticed with our cats, when we relocated to our current home, they cough more than they used to.
I'm Carly Rizzuto, and this is episode 3 of No Land Farms. The Environmental Integrity Project's 2020 report, Poultry Industry Pollution in the Chesapeake Region, quotes a Princess Anne resident living beside 6 chicken houses owned by a real estate investor landlord saying, quote, "The ammonia smell from urine and feces is so strong and so offensive, it's hard to breathe sometimes," end quote. Ammonia is one of the major air emissions from these big chicken operations. In the air, it affects people's health and can lead to asthma attacks, irritated eyes and sinuses, and respiratory inflammation. This resident quoted in the report's well water was not safe to drink, and they did their best to get better regulations for CAFOs in their area. They organized for a policy to require new chicken houses to have air pollution control filters on the fans, and while that didn't pass, Somerset County did add 50 feet to their setbacks between chicken houses and homes. The resident is also mentioned saying, quote, "The poultry industry just went nuts because they did not want any air pollution control filters. It's like the poultry industry bought the whole Eastern Shore and they feel like they can do whatever they want with it." Among others, the report also spotlights a Virginia resident who had 24 chicken houses built next door by a Texas company contracted with Perdue. Also notice that the big operations, being so capital intensive and industrial, aren't generally family farms as people like to think of them. The Virginia resident's yard is described as having visible particles drifting in the air, which are bits of feathers and manure being blown out of the chicken houses. And she describes a constant suffering from respiratory infections, coughing, sneezing, headaches, and a sore throat. These stories from Maryland and Virginia are just 2 examples of the experience shared by many people living close to big chicken CAFOs. Now, despite air pollution emitted from chicken industry facilities affecting people's health and environment, animal agriculture is not required by the EPA to report air emissions under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, And CAFO operators are not required to report hazardous emissions by the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act. Even though the Federal Clean Air Act allows the EPA to develop limit levels for outdoor air pollutants from specific sources, the EPA does not include CAFOs as one of those sources and rejected adding CAFOs in 2017. These exceptions granted to agriculture in U.S. policy manufacture the perfect delay and denial arguments for the chicken industry when it comes to taking accountability for their pollution. One example of this that Delmarva organizers recounted to me was with trying to get the Community Healthy Air Act passed in Maryland. Here's Delegate Robin Lewis explaining the bill in 2018.
The Community Healthy Air Act will provide the Maryland Department of the Environment with the tools it needs and the information it needs to monitor and evaluate air quality of large animal feeding operations. Currently, air quality of large animal feeding operations is not monitored. This bill will enable the MDE to do that. The bill works by establishing a committee on air quality, whose members include regulatory compliance experts from the Attorney General's office, staff from the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE, public health and clinical scientists, and together this group of committee members will craft a study protocol or a plan for studying air quality of these large animal feeding operations.
Kathy Phillips, who was a coastkeeper for the Chesapeake Coastal Trust prior to Gabby, a Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs founder and organizer you met in episodes 1 and 2, testified in support of the Community Healthy Air Act. She explained it to me as this.
All we wanted was for the state of Maryland to monitor the air coming out of these exhaust fans from these giant industrial scale poultry houses and let the public know what's coming out, what is coming out of those houses. We all knew it's ammonia mostly, and a lot of particulate matter, which can't help air quality. That's why these huge poultry houses have these giant 10-foot tall exhaust fans lining the side of the poultry houses, because all that wet manure inside the houses is generating ammonia. And if it wasn't exhausted out, the chickens would die. So they exhaust all that out onto us just so the chickens won't die. But meanwhile, if you live near one of these things, you are breathing that all day long.
The Community Healthy Air Act was introduced to the Maryland legislature 3 times. Each year, it died in committee after its first reading. Here's part of Monica Brooks' testimony, the president of the Wicomico County NAACP and a founder of Concerned Citizens Against Industrial CAFOs, who you heard from in the previous episodes. Monica is speaking in support for the Community Healthy Air Act in 2018.
When I moved to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, besides the beauty of the region, I noted 2 disturbing facts. There are an alarming amount of cancer patients, both young and old, and so many children with diseases like asthma and respiratory problems. The Eastern Shore region has been encroached by large, concentrated animal feeding operations known as CAFOs, and these monstrosity houses, they house hundreds of thousands of chickens, each producing tons of ammonia and, of course, tons of manure. These operations have 18 industrial fans releasing toxins into our air for our children to breathe, and they are not monitored or required to be filtered. These operations are being placed dangerously close to neighborhoods and schools in spite of the large amounts of land available on other parts of the shore, near no one. One such house has been placed, one 4-house CAFO has been placed right across from the playground of my daughter's school. And my protests were unheard, and I was labeled anti-poultry. I'm not anti-poultry, I'm not anti-farming or industry. I'm speaking here because my local delegation has not wanted to hear what I had to say. I think it's important for our local delegation to listen to the responses of all of its constituency, not those with big, deep pockets.
One 2019 letter in support of the bill that was authored by 24 nurses and doctors shared, quote, "In Wicomico County, one of the top broiler producing counties in Maryland, the rate of emergency room visits due to asthma among adults is double the rate of the state overall, end quote. Here's Gabby.
We were demanding air monitors. Like,
Yeah.
If you don't think there's a problem, prove it. If you don't think that there's an issue, put some air monitors next to some CAFOs and let's see what happened. Well, surprisingly, the industry didn't want to do it. Surprisingly, the state didn't want to do it either. And the Community Healthy Air Act went on for 3-4 years, and it never passed. We could never pass it because of the lobby. The poultry lobby fought that so freaking hard.
The groups against the bill included, but were not limited to, the Delmarva Chicken Association, which, remember, that's the industry's regional lobbying group, the Maryland Chamber of Commerce, and the Maryland Farm Bureau. The VP of Perdue Farms, Stephen Levitsky, said in his written 2019 testimony that, quote, "We believe this bill is not needed at this time, based on currently available air sampling and emission studies and pending information from planned ambient air sampling," end quote. So with the first part, he's referencing the National Air Emissions Monitoring Study, which was done by the EPA and land-grant universities and funded by the animal ag industry. The study was not done in Maryland, did not measure air pollution in communities, and its methods and results were determined unusable by the EPA's Science Advisory Board. The pending information that Levitsky mentioned is the Lower Eastern Shore Ambient Air Quality Monitoring Project, a project that, as reported by Civil Eats, was created as a counter-proposal to the Community Healthy Air Act and followed meetings between a deputy director at Maryland Department of the Environment and representatives from the Delmarva Chicken Association, Perdue, and Mount Ayr. The project is funded by the Campbell Foundation, which is a private industry-oriented fund, and by the region's chicken industry lobbying group, the Delmarva Chicken Association, which lobbied against the Community Healthy Air Act and even created a page on their website called A Breath of Fresh Air, where they asked people to oppose the bill. On that page, they quote their own executive director, Holly Porter, saying, quote, "We in the chicken community have a shared interest with all Marylanders in better understanding what air quality is truly like on the Eastern Shore. Because we will never neglect our commitment to environmental responsibility, we believe gathering more data about air quality here helps everyone," end quote. Kathy explained the reality of this study during our conversation.
The state of Maryland finally agreed to do a monitoring study, but it was a farce, and they were doing as little as they possibly could. These CAFOs are under Maryland state permits. And so the state does have some control, to tell them, well, if you want your permit, we need you to do this. We need you to set up or let us set up air monitors outside of your poultry houses. But the state would not do that. And so what they did was they set up 3 air monitors down on the Eastern Shore. One of them was several miles from the nearest CAFO. The second one was closer to a couple of CAFO houses, but was set up behind, there was a big chunk of forest between the CAFO and where they set up the air monitor. And then the third one was set up elsewhere to compare, what air quality is from this one area, to the other. So it was a farce of a study. It never really proved anything. It was not what we were asking for through the legislation. But these warrior women, man, I have so much respect for them. I mean, they fought long and hard. They went to legislative hearings. They helped organize meetings within communities. They became spokespeople, but trying to get the Community Healthy Air Act passed and raising awareness about air quality issues on the Eastern Shore is still a long, hard-fought battle.
Here's Monica's take on the fight for the Community Healthy Air Act.
The industry had more guns than we did, and so it didn't happen. But what did happen as a result of that is years later, some grants came through and more political awareness and environmental justice knowledge came that allowed air monitoring to occur in some of these areas.
The organizers I spoke to have been a part of multiple air quality initiatives in order to get more accurate data for local air pollution and community exposure. Like Gabby worked on a joint study between Assateague Coastal Trust and the Environmental Integrity Project. Also, one of the grants that Monica mentioned is an ongoing community-based air monitoring study that's a collaboration between Sussex Health and Environmental Network, the Sentinels of Eastern Shore Health, and Johns Hopkins to research emissions, particulate matter, and fecal contamination from the region's chicken operations.
And then on the other side, as we tried to warn people about what will happen when you keep an industry unchecked, there were huge contaminations that occurred, in Delaware and here. And now that people's wells have been contaminated and different things that have happened, people are going, oh, but we said this was what we were trying to tell you what was going to happen. And so we have come a long way. And where we started, as I said, where people were trying not to hear anything from us, to now where we get calls from people going, let me know what's going on. And if we have a call to action, they respond right away. I mean, they come, and we're talking all walks of life, all different backgrounds, all different everything, because everyone deserves clean air and clean water. And no one moves to a rural community to worry about the safety of their water and their air.
Looking back on their work so far, Gabby is also hopeful.
A small group of people ended up being so successful in making huge strides for environmental regulatory changes. It's just absolutely insane, like how much we were able to accomplish in a short period of time. But a lot of people were hurt in the process. A lot of people suffered as a consequence. And I do want to take time to recognize that, because there were people that lost their jobs. There were people that were bullied. There were people that were retaliated against. I think it definitely was a learning experience for everybody. But I think we also realized that you can't trust certain people, because it all comes down to money. It comes down to funding. It comes down to who funds the funder. It comes down to who's on the board of these organizations, what kind of influence that some of these organizations have or some of these funders have. It all comes down to that. And that's something else that, I taught some of these residents, is that you always have to look beyond what some of these organizations have. It's it's nice they have staff members and da-da-da-da-da, but who's on the board? Who has influence? Who is steering the ship? Who is, moving an organization in a different direction? Or what do these organizations who do they partner with? Who do they work with? What initiatives do they work on? That is what's really important, because that's kind of where Maria and I learned who we could trust and who we couldn't trust.
Yeah, the industry isn't going to fund someone that's holding them accountable.
Exactly.
Something that's important to know about air pollution is that it doesn't all stay in the air. Pollutants in the air can deposit onto the land and run off into waterways, which is called atmospheric deposition. The air and the water are connected. Here's Maria Payan, a founder and executive director of the Sussex Health and Environmental Network, who you met in previous episodes.
There was an interesting report, Environmental Integrity Project did it on 50 years of the Clean Water Act. Promises, I think it was called Promises Half Kept or something. And it went through state by state. And in Delaware, 97.5% of our rivers and streams are polluted. 97.5%. Let that sink in. 100% of our estuaries. 100%. Okay? So, we really need to rethink the way that we do business in such a concentrated way down here, because there's fish kills. They have days where the bacteria is too high, you can't go in the water. It's not like we don't have information and tools today. We do. So we need to really make wiser decisions.
The Clean Water Act at 50, Promises Half Kept at the Half-Century Mark, was published by the Environmental Integrity Project in 2022. By examining reports that states submit to the EPA under the Clean Water Act, the authors found that 97% of Delaware's rivers and streams are impaired for one or more uses, being swimming and recreation, aquatic life, fish consumption, and as drinking water sources. 97% was the highest of all U.S. states. Like Maria said, 100% of Delaware's estuaries were found to be impaired. And Maryland is right there with Delaware at 100% impairment for estuaries. So we're falling way short of the 1972 Clean Water Act's goals of making all U.S. surface waters fishable and swimmable by 1983 and stopping pollution into U.S. waters by 1985. Large-scale industrial animal ag, including CAFOs, processing plants, and the vast monoculture fertilized fields producing animal feed, is responsible for a lot of the country's water pollution. From 2010 to 2014, the Toxics Release Inventory found that Tyson dumped more than 104 million pounds of toxic waste into U.S. waters. In 2022, chicken houses in Maryland were estimated to generate enough manure to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool every day. This chicken manure, that's mostly spread onto farm fields, contains nitrogen and phosphorus and has also been found to have heavy metals, drug residues, pathogens, and other contaminants in it. So then, especially when it's over-applied to fields or when it's subject to intense rain events with climate change, it inundates soils and runs off into streams, rivers, and bays. In Maryland, two of the main agencies charged with protecting waterways and overseeing agricultural activities are the Maryland Department of the Environment, MDE, and the Maryland Department of Agriculture, MDA.
I'm Tom Pelton. I'm the Director of Communications at the Environmental Integrity Project. We're a 22-year-old nonprofit organization that tries to enforce environmental laws and do investigative reports to expose major pollution problems across the country.
I spoke with Tom Pelton from the Environmental Integrity Project, specifically to understand their 2021 report called Blind Eye to Big Chicken. Who or what are you describing as big chicken when we say like blind eye to big chicken? Who is the big chicken?
Big chicken would be the big corporations like Perdue or Tyson or Mount Air that own contracts on hundreds or thousands of family farms around the country. And they have so much power that I call them big chicken because they can basically tell legislators what to do. Even governors are afraid of them because of their political power. They have lobbying and public relations departments that are very, very aggressive. When our report came out, they were attacking it immediately and aggressively. And they're well-funded and they are tough.
Okay, let's get into the report.
So we have a team of data analysts, and they're really, really good at what they do. And they looked at the inspection reports of 182 different Maryland chicken farms. So, thousands and thousands of pages of records. And first we did a Maryland Public Information Act request, a Freedom of Information Act request to get all the documents. Then the research team went through all the documents and made spreadsheets and kind of crunched the numbers. Mm-hmm. When they looked at all the records and they looked at how often they were actually following the law, they found that 84% of the 182 poultry operations inspected by the state had violated their water pollution control permits, basically breaking the law. But only 4 facilities, only 2% of the total, were ever penalized for it. So we found a lot of violations of Clean Water Act standards and very few penalties, very little accountability.
MDE is supposed to keep growers accountable to water pollution control permits under the Clean Water Act, and MDA is supposed to keep them accountable to manure management plans so that poultry litter is not over-applied to fields.
Very seldom do they get out and actually physically on the ground inspect the facilities. Often it's just kind of a paperwork exercise. Yep, I'll look at the paper. They sent me the report. Check. Here's my inspection right here. Check. So the process was very superficial, and it involved not much on the ground testing of the facilities. And it involved what I would do if I were the Maryland Department of the Environment and I had a poultry farm that I was going to inspect, I'd go out there and not only look at the chickens, look at the piles of manure, I would go and sample the water nearby, sample the water downstream from the facility to see how the bacteria levels are, how the phosphorus levels are. They never, ever do that. They never actually check the rivers and streams nearby these facilities.
EIP's findings from their 2021 report discovered that MDE, which only began regulating animal feeding operations through the Clean Water Act in 2009, had just 3 inspectors for Maryland's over 500 chicken operations. With that limited person power, I'd argue it's impossible for MDE to do regular in-person monitoring of nearby water quality and of ammonia air pollution levels at chicken houses and neighbors' homes, which we really need them to be able to do.
And, when it comes to farmers have to submit reports to the state about what is the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in their fields. They have to monitor it. They're not supposed to over-apply manure because then it'll run off into streams and rivers. But the MDE never comes out and checks the fields. The farmers themselves hire a contractor who checks the fields. And because the contractor works for the farmer, they're not inclined to say anything negative. They're not inclined to do anything that'll get them fired.
A 2020 Environmental Integrity Project report called Poultry Industry Pollution in the Chesapeake Region found that based on EPA data, all farms in the Chesapeake Bay watershed were estimated to contribute greater than 119 million pounds of nitrogen pollution into the bay annually, which is greater than triple the nitrogen pollution from the watershed's municipal sewage plants and industrial wastewater treatment plants, and approximately 45% of all nitrogen pollution into the bay. What about MDA, too? What were the government oversight related things you found from the MDA?
So the Maryland Department of Agriculture historically has been kind of an agent of the agricultural industry. They're often run by a former farm lobby director. And they see it as their job is to promote the agricultural industry. So they don't have the inclination or the personnel to do any kind of serious investigation of the poultry operations and their pollution. That's not what they're set up to do.
At the time of EIP's report, MDA had just 9 people working on fertilizer management for 5,251 farms. They also did not sample air quality or nutrient levels in farm fields or nearby streams.
They're almost like a chamber of commerce of sorts, there to hype, promote our great agriculture in our state. There is paperwork that they do demand. And if you're a farmer in Maryland and you don't file your annual reports, nutrient management plans, and application statistics, you will get fined, which is good. But again, it's kind of a paperwork exercise. There was one independent scholar who did a study and she found that Maryland farmers will write, she interviewed farmers anonymously, and they told her that they would write one thing in their report they wrote for the state and then do something completely different out in the field. And so there was basically deception that was going on, lies.
Another interesting piece to this report was what the Environmental Integrity Project found from looking at aerial imagery.
We looked at the aerial images of 529 aerial Eastern Shore poultry houses. And then we found 174 of them, or a third, are within 400 feet of a house owned by a neighbor. So a little more than a football field away. So a third of them are relatively close. And that means, and we went out and interviewed a lot of residents, and they complain about the ammonia odors, the dust, particulate matter from the manure and from the exhaust fans of these facilities. But basically, we found that about a third of the 529 poultry houses were close to neighboring homes, and only a small percentage, 68, had buffers of trees, things like that, to filter out or protect the neighbors from that air pollution. So it was a real problem.
Going off of, you mentioned the manure disposal methods that you were looking at. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the findings for that. So what were the manure disposal methods across the region?
Yeah, what farmers are supposed to do is, keep the manure from the chicken houses covered in a barn so that water doesn't get into it and doesn't wash into nearby streams. And then they're supposed to apply it in moderate amounts, well-controlled amounts to nearby fields, so that it's not over-applied, so it doesn't run into waterways. And what we found was that Often farmers would leave the manure piles in the rain. They would leave bunches of the manure here and there, and the water would wash it into nearby streams. So there really wasn't any kind of, there was some effort to keep it out of the rain in some circumstances, but really a huge number of facilities with the manure in places where water can wash it into nearby streams. And that was a real problem.
EIP study also found that 439 of 503 Maryland chicken operations did not have their own farm fields to spread manure. These are the farms that Delmarva organizers are referring to when they talk about no land farms. So 87% of the Maryland chicken farms at this time were no land farms. The manure produced by these chickens gets stored in ways often vulnerable to flooding and runoff until it can be sold off-site, where its application rate onto fields or pollution created from the products it's made into aren't tracked by the MDE.
Again, over-application of the manure on the fields was also a real problem. Some of the fields are already so saturated, for example, with nitrogen or phosphorus from decades of manure application that they would just keep piling more and more and more manure into the same fields, almost like as a disposal method. They say it's to fertilize the corn, and it does fertilize the corn, but it's also kind of like a dump. You're making kind of a dump. And so the extreme over-application of the manure in ways it just runs off into the streams and rivers, and not putting the manure in places where it's protected from rain.
Based on MDE records of 77 chicken operations that applied manure to their own farm fields, 57 provided info for EIP to evaluate whether they over-applied that manure or not, and 55 of those 57 had indeed over-applied the chicken litter to their crops. In November of 2024, I sat down with David Reed, the executive director of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance.
I'm David Reed. I'm the executive director of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, and all the major rivers on the Eastern Shore, the Choptank, the Nanticoke, the Pocomoke, all of them are impaired for nitrogen. And we were looking around at all the pollution sources, and agriculture is a big one. And there were areas where we saw all this extra pollution, and essentially through a lot of modeling and research and work with our partners, realized that it was coming from concentrated animal feeding operations in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. So we were working with the Assateague Coastal Trust, and the permit was coming back up. And when I say permit, I mean Maryland's general permit to regulate concentrated animal feeding operations.
CAFOs are listed as point sources for pollution under the Clean Water Act. So we have the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System to manage their manure and nutrient runoff. NPDES permits are usually issued by states and differ depending on the industry's influence on state governments. Over the past few years, there have been attempts to get ammonia emissions added to these general discharge permits for chicken operations in Maryland.
What's not accounted for in the industry is what's coming out of those houses, which is particulate matter, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other pollutants. And at that scale, it really matters for the region. It matters for the neighborhoods. It matters for people across the street. It matters for people down the street. It matters countywide, frankly, because cumulatively, it creates serious air pollution problems. But with regard to ammonia, it deposits back locally in those counties and all along those, lots of wetlands on the Eastern Shore, and it deposits as nitrogen. These things were studied by EPA and nothing ever came of it. And it has the interesting issue of being an air emission. So you have these houses and you have all of these chickens, and it's blasting out through these exhaust fans all of this particulate matter, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. And it's totally unregulated. It's this giant pollution stream.
About 40% of ammonia redeposits within 1.5 miles of where it was emitted, and the rest, or the majority, has been found to redeposit within about 31 miles of where it was emitted.
The industry would just say, well, it just goes away. It's an air emission. It's just away. So you can't regulate that under a Clean Water Act permit. we had been scratching our heads thinking about, well, ammonia is technically an air pollutant, and it's an air pollutant in Maryland. Maybe we should petition the state to do that. And the state said, no, we can't for all these technical reasons. And then we tried to get them to acknowledge it in their statewide permit for the industry. And they said, no, it's an air emission. So it's like, okay, we can't regulate it in the air. We can't regulate it in the water. So we're just not going to. We started to work on the theory of regulating it in a water pollution permit. And so our argument was, well, Maryland law very clearly includes emissions, gaseous emissions, as a potential pollutant that's governed by the Water Pollution Control Act. So the state law is more expansive than federal law. Now, we argue that federal law also contemplates that, because when it deposits directly onto the ground and then washes into a waterway, it's a pollutant, a discharge.
The case began with Chesapeake Coastal Trust submitting a petition for judicial review, asserting that MDE needed to include controlling ammonia emissions from chicken houses in the reissuance of the state discharge permits. Chesapeake Coastal Trust and David's team at the Chesapeake Legal Alliance won the case at Maryland's lower court level. But then MDE, the state environmental department, appealed the decision to further regulate pollutants. So the case went to the Intermediate Appellate Court and then up to the Maryland Supreme Court. David explained to me that MDE initially argued at the lower court that they don't regulate ammonia because it's an air emission and that the state and federal law doesn't regulate these air emissions. But as they moved up courts, their litigation strategy changed. Here's David explaining MDE's argument at the Maryland Supreme Court.
What their argument was at the Supreme Court was, well, we're just kidding. We always thought we regulated ammonia. We just do it at our discretion on a site-by-site basis. And so at the Supreme Court level, we certainly tried to point that out, and we did at great pains. Said, A, they can't change their litigation strategy, and B, even if they could and you allow it, what's their criteria? They've never regulated one of these, not once, based on ammonia emissions. What is the site-specific criteria they have? When did they apply it? Why don't they show it to us? And the state essentially said, don't worry, we're doing that. And the court really clung to that. They accepted the argument and they clung to it and said, well, these controls that you say are mandatory are not. And there shouldn't be, you can't force the agency to impose water quality-based effluent limitations and numeric criteria and other types of controls. And you also can't force the agency to identify certain best management practices that are mandatory. What you can do is trust the agency to regulate it. And that's what they ended up saying, is we trust that the agency is going to do the site-specific analysis. And of course, we argued till we were blue in the face that they haven't shown what the criteria are. They haven't shown a single example of an analysis, and they haven't showed a single example of actually imposing these controls that they say are site-specific. And the dissent identified that very clearly. The dissent was blistering and immediately said, there are communities throughout the Eastern Shore that are suffering because of this pollution. And the rivers are impaired by this pollution and the bays impaired by this pollution. And it's clear that Maryland law requires it to be controlled. And you're simply refusing to do that. And it's clear that the agency said they didn't have authority. And one of the things that we argued and was picked up by the dissent was there's a good public policy reason that you can't have this post hoc rationalization, this change in the justification by the agency. And it's because in their response to comments at the permit drafting, in their argument to the lower court, they announced to the public and they announced to industry, we don't have the authority to regulate these emissions. So they announced what they could and couldn't do. And then to the Supreme Court, they had this sort of backdoor explanation. And unfortunately, much to our chagrin and frankly everybody's surprise, it worked. The Maryland Supreme Court decided it was 6-1. And it's probably worth noting that it was 6 Republican governor appointees to 1 Democratic governor appointee.
The 6 judges were Larry Hogan appointees. Hogan, who was the governor of Maryland from 2015 to 2023, has had a conservative political career backed by the chicken industry. For example, in the 2024 election cycle, the owner of Mount Air and generous donator to Trump and a plethora of far-right causes, Ronald Cameron, donated to Hogan's U.S. Senate campaign and to other groups supporting Hogan, like $250,000 to the Maryland's Future PAC, which paid for a large portion of Hogan's U.S. Senate campaign advertisements. Hogan did lose that election, by the way, which was a nice win.
What was striking was, if you read the dissent was just as amazed as we were. It was a sort of what game were you watching kind of dissent. Because the majority essentially said, well, the agency is doing this analysis and they have discretion to do it. And you can't require them to regulate it. They'll regulate it when they see fit. And we had demonstrated, based on the record and in our pleadings, look, this is ubiquitous. Every operation on the Eastern Shore, some enormous percentage of the operations were within less than a mile of a water of the state. And the studies and all the data showed determinatively that a huge proportion of the ammonia, form of nitrogen, deposited right there. So it was clear that they were discharging a pollutant to a water of the state, which has to be regulated. But the court essentially said, no, the agency has the discretion of whether or not to regulate it. We said they didn't. And they overturned the lower court. And at that point, the Supreme Court had spoken.
In a press release dated August 9, 2023, the Chesapeake Legal Alliance and Assateague Coastal Trust announced the Maryland Supreme Court ruled to reverse the 2021 decision of the Circuit Court to regulate ammonia emissions in MDE's discharge permit. The one dissenting judge, Shirley M. Watts, wrote, quote, "In my view, the department was required to regulate ammonia emissions under the water pollution control statutes of Maryland. But, unlike the majority, I do not agree that it is clear the general permit does so. Simply put, I am not convinced that the record demonstrates the general permit was intended to and does, in fact, subject ammonia emissions that impact water quality to regulation." End quote. Thinking too, as I was researching this case, just as a citizen, it was striking to me that MDE, the Maryland Department of the Environment, is who you were up against. Mm-hmm. So, why wouldn't MDE be in favor of further regulating pollution? Because that's kind of what it seems like when you read about it.
So there's a term called regulatory capture. And I think this was a combination of a problem of culture at the agency, regulatory capture, but also a resource issue. And all agencies have them. They don't have unlimited resources. And I think that they were frankly afraid of having this involuntary mandatory scheme of regulating this pollution stream. Even though it was a relatively easy way to do it, I think they saw it as too onerous. I think it was sort of a political threat to them because they'd have to go in and have a mandatory another best management practice that was mandated that they would have to impose on agriculture. And there was huge pushback from the Farm Bureau about regulating an air emission in a water permit. And they didn't want to do that. So some of that was understandable. Some of it we really had a hard time understanding, particularly when we tried to discuss it in settlement. When we said, look, we don't want much. There's already funds provided for this. But I think the political pressure was very strong. And I'll be very frank, I also think that at that moment, especially at settlement, it takes real vision, leadership, and courage from some of the administrative staff within the agency, particularly the higher up ones. And there's not a ton of incentive for them to stick their neck out and say, yeah, let's impose this scheme. We're going to settle with you and we agree to implement these aspects of it. Because now that deputy administrator, let's say, or now the head of one of the branches of the agency, let's say, has to essentially take the lead on that. And there's not a lot of reward because in 6 years it'll show up, or 4 years it'll show up as a big win because you've reduced nitrogen emissions and you've improved asthma rates and air quality and you've cleaned up all this pollution. But in the short term, you're going to have a huge political pushback and people are going to be calling the governor's office, yelling and screaming about what the agency's now decided to do. And it falls to one of these, a branch manager or administrator or a deputy administrator. So it's not set up for that kind of creativity.
Kathy Phillips, who you met earlier in the episode, was the coastkeeper at the Chesapeake Coastal Trust at the time.
Maryland Department of the Environment. They're not supposed to be protecting the industries. These are industries they are supposed to be overseeing, and they are supposed to oversee polluting industries to protect the citizens of Maryland. But when it comes to big chicken and the state of Maryland, MDE is totally at their beck and call, and always have been through every administrative change we've had. It's very discouraging, and so that was the height of one of our roller coaster rides, and the lowest of one of our roller coaster rides. But that's the way it's been. I mean, it is not easy. It is a long, hard slog when you are up against a big industry. I mean, look how many years it took, decades it took to control the tobacco industry. So, the battle continues, but it has been very, very difficult. The Chesapeake Bay definitely has its problems, and many, many studies over the years have shown that the biggest problem to the Chesapeake Bay is agriculture.
Nutrient overload in the bay can lead to disproportionately large algal blooms, larger than the system has adapted to handle. These blooms, which, by the way, can be toxic to humans depending on the species composition, die, sink to the bottom, and decompose or mineralize. At scale, this degradation process consumes massive amounts of oxygen from the surrounding water, leading to oxygen depletion zones or dead zones. Fish can't survive there, oysters can't survive there, crabs can't survive there. Pretty much most anything that needs oxygen to survive either dies or is displaced. If you live by the bay, you may have walked on the beach one morning to find crowds of dead fish on the sand. That's an example of a fish kill, which can happen after low oxygen levels in the water from nutrient overload. Dead zones change seasonally, but currently up to about a third of the bay is a dead zone each summer. While parts of the bay have certainly improved over time, climate change, which large-scale industrial animal ag is a big contributor to, is disrupting the estuary even more by increasing warming, acidification, and pollution runoff with more frequent and intense rainfall. In 2025, the EPA and the Bay's watershed states NDC once again failed to meet their cleanup goals, and the new Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement is looking to be weak once again, shedding previous goals and not rising to the moment, especially when it comes to restoring the bay's ecosystems, responding to climate change, and of course with agriculture. Like the current draft doesn't even have any requirements for reducing nutrient overload from agriculture in the bay's watershed. If we go back to the Clean Water Act standards of impairment for the U.S.'s surface waters, from 1985 to 2025, the Chesapeake Bay has seen a less than 2% improvement in impairment from pollution. To bring us to a close, I'm going to share one of Kathy's last stories from her time as a coastkeeper.
So one of the things that DNR did maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, they put a lot of state money into creating these oyster beds and I think also clams at the mouth of the Minokan River. The Minokan River flows through Somerset County out to the Chesapeake Bay in the Pocomoke Sound.
The Minokan River Oyster Sanctuary Project was part of the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement to improve pollution in the bay by building what it claims to be the biggest oyster sanctuary in the world. Today, the Chesapeake Bay's oyster population is about 3% the size of the oyster population recorded in 1890. If you're wondering why we're talking about oysters now when this is about the chicken industry, bear with me, it's all connected.
So in the Pocomoke Sound at the mouth of the Minokan River, DNR did this Department of Natural Resources or Maryland did this big project to put in all these water filtering bivalves, oysters, and like I said, you might have to check on this, whether it was also clams.
I checked and I'm pretty sure it's just oysters.
And big press releases about it, and we're doing this to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the problem wasn't at the mouth of the Minokan River. You had to go up the Minokan River through Princess Anne into the Minokan branch and up into an area that is best known by the name of the road that goes through there, Backbone Road. That is the most densely concentrated CAFO landscape in the entire state of Maryland. And the problem was up at the headwaters of the Minokan branch, not at the mouth of the Minokan River. Up there, if you go on Google Earth and you just go east and northeast of Princess Anne and look at that area, you'll see what I mean. Now, all of those CAFOs, and we're talking, some of those had been there for a long time and others were more recently, but some of them are like 10 to 12 houses growing millions of chickens within those houses. And they had all been built before the state of Maryland put stormwater management regulations on the CAFO industry in Maryland. So none of them had stormwater management ponds. None of them had any kind of stormwater management. Whatever manure, when it was hauled out of the houses, got dropped on the ground, that was getting washed off into the Minokan branch. The ammonia coming out of those houses, the ammonia deposition was adding nitrogen to the Minokan branch. All these pollutants from that area were going into the Minokan branch, and nothing was being done to fix it upstream. This is what a waterkeeper deals with all the time. The problem is always upstream. If you have a pollution problem, you've got to go look upstream. And we've never quite been able to get our state environmental agencies to think that way.
So this is not a reason, sure, to stop these oyster projects. We do want larger oyster populations in the bay. But they are not done at scales large enough to actually be a solution to bay-wide nutrient inputs. Making even small increases to the base oyster population is immensely difficult. People do their whole master's degrees and more on how to best seed oysters to find incremental improvements that only work in XYZ conditions. And we're doing this largely in the absence of bettering the environment in which the oysters are living. Similar to when a coral reef dies, you can't just go and plant another one right where it was before. They take many years to grow, and there's reasons it died there in the first place that need attention. Planting a billion trees, oysters, reefs, or whatever else to save the climate or to save the bay is a math problem that's removed from the reality of environmental issues. Kathy's point about going to the source of a problem for the effective solutions, for me, brings up a lot of questions surrounding environmental work in the Chesapeake Bay. Like, what are the root causes of the bay's pollution? And what worldviews and mindsets have prevented the people in charge and with the capital from tackling those root causes, and instead only allowing downstream Band-Aid type fixes, if anything at all? What systems could support redistributing the decision-making power to the people living by, working in, and caring for these waters daily? What would it look like if we transformed our societal systems around the understanding that humans are interdependent with their environments, that we are nature, and that future generations of plants, animals, and waterways deserve to flourish? Who was already doing this work?
And so here was this great project that everybody was applauding going on down in the Pocomoke Sound at the mouth of the Minokan River. And it wasn't going to fix anything because you hadn't stopped the flow of pollution upstream. So, again, if the industry is not regulated properly, these types of pollution problems will continue, and the Chesapeake Bay will continue to suffer. Our local waterways will continue to suffer, and this is the crux of the problem on Delmarva.
Thinking about intention and mindsets and imagining how we want to live together and then acting on that will also force us to look critically at Save the Bay projects and who's funding them. Do quote-unquote sustainability initiatives funded by the Delmarva Chicken Association and Perdue really stand to tackle the root issues of the Chesapeake Bay's pollution and so transition us to a better food system? There's even oyster restoration funded by Northrop Grumman, a weapons manufacturing company claiming to be saving the bay. The projects that pique the interests of companies designed to profit off of extraction and exploitation aren't probably the ones that will have the most impact on changing the tides. I'm not saying that some of these projects don't have value, but don't let them be a distraction from real transformation. Agribusiness, and the war industry, since I mentioned Northrop Grumman, are pleased with our current pay-to-play fake democracy and consistently lobby for their own profits over people and ecosystems, as we've heard about today. They aren't going to be funding the things that hold them accountable, that redistribute their power, or that regulate their pollution so that the oysters and life in the bay can actually thrive in the long term. Agribusiness has a tight grip on the state and its people. In episode 4, we're going to venture further into the influence of the chicken industry on the public and policymakers in Delmarva, and we'll examine the claim that this factory farm food system feeds the world.